We do have a quorum. The Government Operations and Elections Committee will come to order. Representative Hornstein, did you get an opportunity to review the minutes from Wednesday?
I would move the minutes of Wednesday.
Representative Hornstein moves the minutes from Wednesday, March 7th. Any discussion or changes? Seeing none, all those in favor of approval of the minutes, please signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, nay. Minutes are approved. We have one item on the agenda today, and I'd like to start by just kind of laying out some parameters. Since this room is so busy, if you could keep your talk down low and not applaud or reply when people are testifying. That takes up more of our committee time because we have to wait for the crowd to calm down. So if you could just try to be respectful and understand there's a lot of people who are trying to hear. Secondly, there are a lot of people on the list to testify, so we're going to limit testimony to 1 to 2 minutes, and we will have Ms. Hanson will have a 30-second card, and please note that if you go over that time period, then you're going to be preventing someone else from being able to testify. What else do I want to say? And also, since we are going to be listening to so many witnesses, please also keep in mind that we did hear several days of testimony on this issue last session. So please try to listen to the speakers before you. And if they've already said what you were going to say, try to say something different. It's not particularly helpful to hear the same argument from people over and over again. So try to make your comments unique. And if it's already been said what you want to say, if you could just pass on to the next person, that would be appreciated as well. Anything else I need to mention? Okay. Having said that, I will move House File 2738 be recommended to pass and be re-referred to the Committee on Ways and Means. To your bill, Representative Kiffmeyer, and would you like to start with the DE1 amendment? Is that the amendment we'll be working from?
Yes, Madam Chair, that is it, the DE1.
Since the DE1 is the entirety of the bill we will be working on, my intention would be to pass the DE1 amendment and then have testimony after we get it in the shape the author would like. Is that okay with everyone? Okay. I'll renew my motion to move the DE1 amendment for approval. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. Now the bill is in the shape you'd like, and to your bill, Representative Kiffmeyer.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair and committee members. Very pleased to join you today, and thank you for giving time to House File 2538, the constitutional amendment requiring photo ID, a free ID, eligibility verification. This is really an important issue before us today, and that this will allow us to have everybody who is eligible to vote to be able to vote. That's a very important issue for all of us here today, very important for every single member, very important to all of the people of Minnesota, and we recognize that, and we are well aware of the needs that are required here in addition to that. Minnesota's election system is a system. We have a system that starts with voter registration and concludes with the counting and possibly recounting. So it is important to recognize that at the end of our system, we've got the counting down, that we have the ability to count the ballots, to have openness and transparency, to have accuracy, and to have integrity in that counting process. In the beginning of the process, we have voter registration, and that part of the process should have an equal level of integrity, accuracy, and all of the elements that enable us to have access to voting and eligible voters to vote to be there in that part of the system as well. And we are in good company. The President Jimmy Carter was able to support photo ID as part of the Federal Elections Commission on Election Reform. The U.S. Supreme Court, Justice Stevens, also supports photo ID and has written about it. Andrew Young, former African-American mayor of Atlanta, Georgia, supports photo ID. Matter of fact, he stated that it would be a disenfranchisement to not require a photo ID, a very strong endorsement. In addition to that, a majority of states also require an ID, and Minnesota is only one of 2 states that even allow vouching, which means absolutely no ID at all in addition to same-day registration and a live ballot. This constitutional amendment will allow everyone eligible to vote to cast their vote and ensures integrity, because the public does have a right to know. Who you are and where you live is a public right to know. Who you vote for is a very secret issue, and I consider that very sacred to our voters. But who you are and where you live is a matter of the public right to know. And matter of fact, Minnesota's voter registration list is a matter of public knowledge and is used actively in the campaigning process and in the election process. We are fully aware of the U.S. Supreme Court, which has upheld the photo ID constitutionality, including those key elements in regards to making sure that everybody eligible to vote can vote. As a matter of fact, our Minnesota State Constitution, already 150 years, has requirements as a part of the voting process. Voting is a right, but you must be 18 years old on Election Day or before, a United States citizen, a resident of the state of Minnesota. If you're a felon, that you finish serving all of your time, including parole or that part of the sentencing. And if you're a guardianship and you do not have the right to vote, then you're not permitted to vote. It's interesting, as I have read many of the court cases in regards to what is said in regards to the actual casting of your vote. The courts have recognized the constitutionality, but they also said several other statements that I think are really important. From the U.S. Supreme Court, the electoral system cannot inspire public confidence if no safeguards exist to deter or detect fraud or to confirm the identity of voters. Inspiring public confidence has been a mission of mine for many, many, many years. In addition, the U.S. Supreme Court says that confidence in the integrity of our electoral process is essential to the functioning of our participatory democracy. Voter fraud drives honest citizens out of the democratic process and breeds distrust of our government. Voters who fear their legitimate votes will be outweighed by fraudulent ones will feel disenfranchised. In addition, the universally applicable requirements of Indiana's voter identification law are eminently reasonable. The burden of acquiring, possessing, and showing a free photo ID is simply not severe because it does not even represent a significant increase over the usual burdens of voting. And the state's interests are sufficient to sustain that minimal burden. So indeed, whether it is President Jimmy Carter, the U.S. Supreme Court, Justice Stevens, a variety of issues, that this is a constitutional approach to this having a photo ID requirement. Now, as an election judge for 11 years, while working in the polling place, and I have a stranger in front of me saying their name, I would often think to myself, why not just show an ID? I think that over 80% of Minnesotans in the latest statewide survey also feel the same way. Just show your ID. And I think that fact of that high number of percent shows that the people of Minnesota say, we don't have that full confidence. We are not confident. Otherwise, you don't get that 80%, including 64% of Democrats. When you are casting your ballot, there are two issues as far as implementing House File 2538 constitutional amendment. And one of them is your identity. The other is residency. And the two are handled differently. And so, Madam Chair, I just want to go through a few ways that I think it is important to address some of the issues that might be out there. One of those is in absentee voting. This constitutional amendment will allow absentee voting, just as our current constitutional language in Article 7 allows for absentee voting. This will continue that practice. In your folders today, I have a copy of the current absentee voting, the ballot envelope, the exterior envelope. If you'll note on that exterior envelope, there is a place already to capture the Minnesota State identification card number, the driver's license number, the last four digits of Social Security, or a checkbox in case you don't have any of those three at all. And so you can see there already that this absentee ballot in its current form is already compliant with this constitutional amendment. In addition, the overseas voters and military voters in Uokava also have I have a copy of that for you, and special for them, there are a lot of ID requirements there also. And then for those who say are not registered to vote but want to cast an absentee ballot, there's a special envelope for that already. And so I think you can see, members, that in regards to absentee voting, we already have a good process, and this constitutional amendment allows that to continue. How will ID work in Minnesota? Voters will simply be asked to verify their identity at the time of voting by presenting a photo ID. If they do not have one, this constitutional amendment will require that the state provide one at no charge, and if an eligible voter does not have a photo ID on Election Day, they will be able to cast a provisional ballot. And this is required by federal law as well as court decisions. So what if you are a senior citizen and do not have a birth certificate or a marriage license? Will you be able to acquire photo ID in order to vote? And members, we have a testifier who will describe a little bit of that process, and that will be with you. So if you can't afford the cost of getting a photo ID, one will be provided for you. And I absolutely am confident that when this constitutional amendment passes, that we in the legislature will pass enabling legislation, and as I have supported before, there will be sufficient funds to make sure we have a strong voter education effort, working with AARP, Minnesota State Council on Disabilities, the Disability Law Center, any other organizations and any other entities to make sure that every eligible voter has the opportunity to get the free ID as required by this constitutional amendment. And I look forward to that. I think that's going to be a very strong component of that, and I'm absolutely confident that all of us, Democrats and Republicans, will work together to make sure that that happens. Do you have to have your current address on your driver's license or your state ID card if that is what you are using? No, you don't. Current law already says that if that current address is on your state driver's license or your Minnesota state ID card, that's great. You have it together in one package. But you have identity and residency. And so maybe you have a driver's license that you've renewed. So you would use the clip card plus a receipt for one to take care of both identity and residency. Minnesota state law has other ways right now also to verify your residency, and those are continued. And matter of fact, we included something for those people who are in nursing homes or in battered women's shelters that the administrator of the facility in previous statutory bill, which I would think would continue in the future as well in future enacting legislation, that the administrator of those facilities can certify as to residency. So I think we've already proven by the statutory bill previously passed that we will definitely take care of those that have that kind of a situation. What about college students? Well, I think it would be very well for college students to use an ID from another state. After all, your identity doesn't change, your residency does. And so they'll be able to expand the list of IDs that they can use. So it's not restricted to just the Minnesota driver's license or Minnesota ID card, but another state's ID or driver's license will work as well. That in addition to a student housing list or other kinds of residency that they will be able to use, such as the student housing list. So it is important to realize that these are the kinds of issues that will enable everybody to vote, everybody to get a free ID, and that we will protect everybody's access to getting a ballot and also ensure integrity in the election process. Madam Chair, with that, I'm glad to have questions or to allow our testifiers in particular in regards to the birth certificate issue. I do have a testifier.
Okay, go ahead and bring your witness up, Representative Kiffmeyer.
Pat McCormick. Madam Chair, while we are waiting, I wanted to also touch on mail balloting. Under this constitutional amendment, mail balloting, which is popular in some of our townships, in accordance with Minnesota law, will also be continued.
Welcome to the committee, Ms. McCormick. If you could just identify yourself for the tape.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. For the record, Pat McCormick, the Director of Driver and Vehicle Services. I am waiting for, I just was asked to be at the hearing to respond to questions. So,
Madam Chair, I was just going to have Ms. McCormick just go through a little bit of the process for getting an ID.
Okay. Ms. McCormick, would you like to?
Certainly. If you are applying for either a Minnesota driver's license, an ID, or a permit, you must present either a driver's license that you currently have, and that is current and hasn't expired, that has a photo on it. If it doesn't have a photo, then it has to be less than a year old. Otherwise, you would have to submit to DVS a primary and a secondary document, and we have a list of those, and I do have handouts that I could provide to the committee if they would like that.
It's in the packet.
You have the packet. Okay, so we...
I believe it might be in our packets, Ms. McCormick.
So every applicant has to have at least one primary and one secondary document, and if they can have two primary documents and not a secondary document, and those must be submitted at your initial application for a driver's license or for an ID card. Then if we review those documents to ensure that they meet the standards that we have, and that some documents are for people that are here on a temporary basis. They are legal presence, so there are legal presence documents, and then there are other documents including a certified birth certificate, various U.S. documents that report on birth, and also a certified adoption record, a secure tribal ID card that has been approved by DVS, unexpired active duty U.S. military identification card, or a valid passport or passport card would also suffice. And there are other cards that are listed in the list. And in terms of secondary documents, we require it could be a social security number, card, certified marriage certificates, also could be a certified transcript from college or high school, as well as a grade report. So there's various documents that we allow you to use. And if you don't have these documents, there is a variance process that is allowed under administrative rules. And that variance process requires a $10 fee, as well as providing filling out an application that we have, and then being able to submit documents according to the rules that would somehow allow our staff to be able to identify that you are the person you say you are. So it would involve various documents that would have your legal name on them, but they might not be certified documents. It's a very time-consuming process, and that's why there's a fee for it. And I can tell you that in the last year, we had 840 requests for variances. 586 were granted, and 260 were denied. There's very specific criteria that our department has to look at in terms of approving a variance, because, as you know, we're talking about documents that are identity documents, and we have to ensure that we're preventing fraud, because driver's licenses are not only used for driving in today's world, and so we have to ensure that it's a secure and that the people are who they say they are. So we do have that process in place, but it takes a lot of, we have 30 days in which we can make a decision about a variance. We try to turn them around within 3 days, but with what I mean by turning around is starting a discussion with an applicant, because oftentimes we have to work back and forth with applicants to get the right documents to be able to prove that they are who they say they are. We have to work with Social Security Administration. It's not a simple process. So that would be the process that would be outside of the standard driver license and ID card application.
Madam Chair?
Representative Kiffmeyer.
I want to thank Ms. McCormick for her testimony in regards to this, because I think it is important that in implementing a photo ID requirement, that we are able to make sure that everybody entitled to a ballot gets a ballot, that they have their eligibility established. But I think for consideration in the future that we in the legislature will consider this sort of situation and make accommodations as appropriate through the legislature. And I think that I appreciate hearing her information, because I think that's an important part of us. And I think the big thing for us, I didn't have any other question. I didn't want to make you feel.
Okay, well, I just didn't know if you wouldn't need me up here anymore.
I'll let you know, or they will. Yeah.
Ms. McCormick, if you could just stay there a second, there might be questions for you.
Okay.
Representative Nelson first.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Madam Representative Kiffmeyer, is it your intent with this constitutional amendment? They keep talking. There's no cost to get an ID, but yet to get a variance, if you don't have the proper documentation, there's a $10 fee here. Is it your intent to get that fee waived also? Because there's a cost there. I guess that's the question I have.
Representative Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Representative Nelson and members. I think that's something that we in the legislature should take a look at next year. That's one of those specific areas that are tied to actually getting your ID, something specific like that. And so I'm sure that you and I can work together on that for considering that. That would be a funding question for next year.
Representative Skelty.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And from what I heard from that maybe the answer is no. I'm not sure what the funding, I mean, if we have a deficit next year, I don't know where the funding's coming from. But for Ms. McCormick, if I go into my suburban place to get my license changed or to receive, say I don't have a license and I want to receive a voter ID card, procedurally, just how long will it be before I actually receive that card once I've paid for it?
Ms. McCormick.
Madam Chair and Representative Scalzi, right now our current turnaround is 20 days, I think, for a driver's license. We have an expedited process, as I think most of you know, but there's a $20 charge for the expedited driver's license, and that you can get within 3 days.
Representative Skelzy.
So with the 20-day turnaround, then, Representative Kiffmeyer, how does that coincide with a provisional ballot for which then we would have to bring a current photo ID after 20 days? How would I then be able to vote?
Representative Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Representative Scalzi, and members. And by the way, when I say that that is something to consider, that sort of fee, that is not a no. Just as we in the legislature always know that that is not a no. And so it's something that we will consider and for next year. I think the question again, Madam Chair, sorry.
Representative Skelzy.
The question was, if there's a 20-day turnaround unless I pay an extra $20 fee for an expedited turnaround once I go into my suburban license center, how does that coincide with the requirements for providing that photo ID with the provision to, after I have a provisional ballot, do I have more than 20 days to make sure that my vote is counted on Election Day?
Representative Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Representative Scalzi and members. I think it's very important to remember that a big part of this is the funding of the voter education requirement and an aggressive effort to make sure that everybody has that free ID and has the time to get that ID. And also a receipt for one, and also the variance, other things like that, is something that if we want to do something specific in legislation next year, which would be the how process or the timing process. But I think the most important thing is the spending of the money and the resources to make sure that we have those funds. And this is a priority. When we have a budget and we set a budget and you have a constitutional requirement, that's a priority for spending those funds that are necessary to include those things.
Representative Scelzi.
Just as a follow-up, I guess when I hear you say the how process or the timing process, I don't see that on this constitutional amendment. So the voters then, how will the voters know that there's a how process or a timing process to be determined later when they go into the ballot in November of 2012?
Representative Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Representative Scelzi. This is a constitutional amendment, and the language of the constitutional amendment is already understood in the sense by voters, in other words, requiring a free ID. And I think also that, as is customary, you pass a constitutional amendment, and once it is passed, then the legislature has the responsibility. But the interesting thing here is we already have an example of legislation that already came before this body, both last year and this year, that gives us some guidance as to how this might work. So it's not like we're starting from scratch, or that we don't already have 10 chapters of election law to give guidance to many of these things. The exercising of the free ID, that it would be a state ID, and funding of that. It's already an ID process. There are already a lot of things in place and can be enacted very quickly. It's a process already in place. Voter education money can quickly be allocated by the legislature, and make sure that we work with all groups and all agencies and all entities to get the message out, not only this year but also in future years.
Representative Scelzi.
I guess my concern is the language that will be on the ballot in November of 2012, because the language says that shall it be amended to require all voters to present valid photo identification on Election Day. But my election judges tell me that about 20% of the people vote by absentee ballot. And I represent a city that half of their housing units are in multiples. So we've made great efforts through multi-housing coalition and things like that to enable the managers of these units to go to the polling place. If somebody moved in November 1st and their photo ID is not current, the voters are not going to be able to know that they have to make a provision for those people that maybe have a problem like that. And the 20% of people that vote by absentee ballot could use the last 4 digits of their Social Security number. So somebody going into the voting booth, voting on this particular amendment, they don't know that. It's like we're telling them part of the story. How are you going to let the voters know that 20% of the people, and that's what my election judges tell me, aren't going to have to show a photo ID because they're going to be voting by absentee ballot? So this should really say that 80% of the voters, if that's what it is, and that could be verified. How are we going to let the voters know in the ballot box?
Representative Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative Scelzi. Well, first of all, those 20% of the voters who are voting absentee already know those requirements because they vote absentee.
All right.
So they fill out that information. So I believe they are quite well aware of that, and that will be continued as is stated here today.
Representative Scelzi.
And I don't mean the absentee voters. Yes, of course they know because they've read the ballot. I mean the voters voting on this constitutional amendment. They don't know that 20% of the voters only have to show the last 4 digits of their Social Security number. So we have 2 classes of voters. We have the absentee voters who could just use the last 4 digits of their Social Security number. The voters going into the voting booth in 2012 don't know that. They're going on the idea that all voters will have to show a valid photo ID, when in fact 20% of them won't know. How do you educate the voters looking at your proposed amendment that says all voters?
Representative Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Representative Scelzi and members. I think you underestimate the fact that already 80% of Minnesotans have said that they support a photo ID requirement. Those who vote an absentee ballot are already familiar with the process, and I think it will be, you take that basis, that current basis, And I'm sure there will be lots of voter education going on before the election day as well by everybody whose name is on the ballot, by all these supporting groups, and I am absolutely confident they will be able to communicate the information. But I think most importantly, every voter stands in line and casts their ballot. They have personal experience with voting. They have personal experience with registering. They have personal experience already. And so the simple language of the constitutional amendment, I think, to the large majority of people is pretty straightforward and quite clear.
And Representative Scully, I'd also add, it says all voters to present valid photo identification on election day. So it doesn't say anything about absentee. So if it's election day, they have to provide the photo identification. That's what the amendment says.
Thank you, Ms. Chair, and I understand that. It's just that the people voting on this amendment don't know that 20% of the people are not included with this amendment. That's the people I'm talking about, the people that
Madam
are
Chair?
voting on this particular amendment.
Representative Kiffmeyer?
That's, I think we've covered.
We'll move on. We've got a few questions. And please, members, also remember we do have a really long list of witnesses. Representative O'Driscoll?
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is a question to Ms. McCormick, because you are with the Department of Public Safety and do deal with the issuances of driver's license and other forms of ID in the state of Minnesota for those who do not have Minnesota driver's licenses. I want to kind of build a little bit on something that Representative Scully was talking about. What happens if I move into the state of Minnesota, have a valid driver's license in the state of Wisconsin or any of the other states of Minnesota, or I happen to be a Minnesota resident and have a Minnesota driver's license and change from one residency to another? Can you speak to the requirements under the Department of Motor Vehicle or Public Safety as to what my requirements would be as an individual who's a current license holder?
Ms. McCormick?
Madam Chair and Representative, if you're a current license holder in another state and you move into Minnesota, then you would be able to use your driver's license from the other state as a secondary document, but you would have to also present a primary document, which would be a birth certificate or one of the lists that's listed in the sheet before you. If you are a current resident and you have a Minnesota driver's license and you need to renew it, then you just come in and renew it and fill out the application, and the only time you would be changing anything on the application would be, for instance, if you're, when we do a vision test, you needed glasses, or if you have a new address, that would be a renewal, and you're coming in because you've changed address and not because it's the 4-year renewal, then you would get what we call a duplicate license. And on that license, all we do is change the address. But every 4 years, you have to do the vision test, and you also have to complete an entire application.
Representative O'Driscoll?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. McCormick, if I do change my address in the state of Minnesota from, say, St. Paul and I move to Minneapolis, what's the timeline for me to be able to make that application for the transfer of license, or excuse me, address here in the state of Minnesota with under current state statute?
Ms. McCormick?
Madam Chair and Representative, you're stretching my memory here. I think that we ask within the 30 days, if I'm not mistaken. But I'd have to verify that.
Representative O'Driscoll?
So many of the persons who may be disenfranchised or alleged to be disenfranchised would, under the motor vehicle law, already be having to comply with a license and an address change, on their driver's license within, as you suggested, perhaps 30 days. But there is a provision in statute that would require that to take place. I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but that's what I believe I heard you say.
Ms. McCormick?
Madam Chair and Representative, it is correct that there's a time frame in which you need to present the department with your new address, and basically that's for anything to do with driver compliance issues, so that we have the state of record, and for anything to do with law enforcement.
Okay, if it'd be okay with members, I have 2 more members currently on my list for questions, and then I'd like to get the Secretary of State up to testify, if that would be all right with everyone. I have Representative Hornstein, followed by Representative Winkler.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Ms. McCormick. I know that there's a significant number of people that have just the non-driver license photo ID that are issued. Do you have a sense of the population that has that kind of ID versus the driver's license ID?
Ms. McCormick?
Madam Chair and Representative Hornstein, well, we have various special ID cards, a physical disability card, a temporary physical disability ID card, a developmentally disability ID card, and a mental illness disability card. They're not labeled as such, but those are the various classifications in terms of the rules. Those are offered at a reduced fee, and those require special verification from healthcare providers or a county case manager in order to identify the disability. If it's a temporary one, those are required every 4 years, and the developmentally disability is at the time of application and renewal, which would be 4 years. And the physical permanent disability would only be at the initial application that the verification would be required. So those would be various types of identification cards. Then we also have identification cards for individuals that are not planning on driving for whatever the reason might be, for children that may need identification. And so we have, if you're over 65, you pay a reduced fee, and you don't have to keep renewing your ID card every 4 years. If you're under 65, you must renew your ID card every 4 years.
Representative Hornstein?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Ms. McCormick, do you have data on what percentage of the people that are using these non-driver IDs? You know, you've mentioned the various classes of disability IDs, and then, of course, we have the non-driver ID, a lot of senior citizens, increasing numbers of young people not driving but potentially utilizing that ID. Do you know what percentage of the people that would be eligible to have that kind of ID actually have that ID in their possession?
Ms. McCormick?
Madam Chair and Representative Hornstein, the only thing I can tell you is that Minnesota residents over 65 years of age with state-issued photo IDs as of December 12, 2011, we had 648,518 people with ID cards. I don't have any data with me on the special ID cards. I can certainly make that available to the committee, though.
Just one last question, Madam Chair. So my worry is that there are significant numbers of people that may not be getting these IDs that are eligible for them. I think you had mentioned earlier that 1/3 of the variances are denied, and so, you know, how would these people vote? When Representative Kiffmeyer says everyone eligible to vote to be able to vote, I think it's actually the opposite with this legislation. And so if there's variances that are denied, how would these people then be able to get some kind of a ID card? As well as those that are eligible that just don't. I think that I read somewhere there's at least 10% of senior citizens have no photo ID in their possession that would be valid under this legislation. But let's just focus on the variances that are denied.
Ms. McCormick?
Madam Chair and Representative, all I can tell you is we administer the program according to the rules, and we have to meet the requirements of the rules, and there's very specific criteria that we have to address in order to issue a variance. So if it doesn't fall within that criteria, then we can't we can't grant a variance. So we can only follow what the law requires.
Madam Chair.
Representative Kiffmeyer?
Thank you, Madam Chair and Representative Hornstein. I think this is an area that I appreciate hearing about this, and I am sure, as you and I have worked together in the past, that we can take a look at this issue and, as legislators, to help make sure in a bipartisan fashion that every eligible voter is able to vote and get the ID that they need. We're the legislature. Ms. McCormick is testifying to current law, but we are the legislature. And in our enacting legislation, we are able to review this particular area and get more extensive testimony and give due consideration to the needs of our eligible voters.
Well, Madam Chair, I mean, there you have it.
Representative
There you have it. I mean, we have, again, significant numbers of people that would be potentially disenfranchised under this, and it doesn't seem, I don't think this is too important a matter to be a work in progress. So I'm sure we'll have other areas surfaced here in this hearing of people that wouldn't be qualified to vote under this legislation. But clearly, we have a significant number here that wouldn't be able to get an ID.
Representative Winkler.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative Kiffmeyer, zeroing in on this language on line 1.14, in which you say that the voters must be subject to substantially equivalent identity verification. And your testimony was that we have an absentee process now that permits voters to give an ID number, to give a Social Security number, or to attest to the fact that they don't have any such number. And if they do so, they are able to vote. At the same time, we have a provision under your Section B that says that if you want to vote on the polling place on Election Day, you must present an ID. Not an ID number, but an identification. So is it your testimony and your position that it is substantially equivalent to provide an ID versus presenting a number or stating that you don't have such a number? Is that substantially equivalent?
Representative Kiffmeyer.
Madam Chair and members, Representative Winkler, in regards to some of these matters, in regards to that, but I think that in regards to having an ID, it is certainly important, but substantially equivalent is a phrase that allows us, I mean, we don't expect our military voters to come home from Iraq to show their photo ID. We understand that. We understand there are others who are unable to leave their home. And substantially equivalent allows us to have the necessary court-approved flexibility, in other words, in front of the U.S. Supreme Court or other state Supreme Courts, when there have been some necessary accommodations for those kinds of unique circumstances, we have been able to make those allowances. And that's why substantially equivalent verification is a very important phrase, that we're able to do that and make sure that as far as it is practicable, as far as it is possible, to have equal treatment of the voters. But the courts have also recognized that absentee voting is a necessary accommodation and that we do our very best to treat all voters equally, recognizing those necessary accommodations, just as you have a First Amendment right in regards to religious freedom. There are some people who object to being photographed. Minnesota current law and the courts have upheld that if you have an ID requirement and you have a religious objection, you are able to waive that requirement. So there are areas like that that I think we have made accommodations for, the courts have upheld, and this constitutional amendment will allow us to both have that ID requirement and to make those accommodations as well.
Representative Winkler.
Madam Chair, Representative Kiffmeyer, I'll ask the question again in a very specific and concrete way. Is the current absentee voter verification method substantially equivalent to providing a photographic identification in a polling place?
Representative Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Representative Winkler. That is current law, and that is an example of what we currently have. And we have a constitutional amendment here that gives us the flexibility necessary to accommodate all voters and their needs, and as I've said before, Madam Chair.
Representative Winkler.
Madam Chair, Representative Kiffmeyer, you didn't answer the question, and the reason it's important for you to answer the question is that you're proposing a constitutional amendment. And as Representative Scalzi has pointed out, if we have two different types of verification, we have writing a number versus presenting a photo ID. I'm going to guess that an enterprising individual might feel like they're being treated unequally if they come to the polling place and have to show a photo ID and didn't have one, but instead could have filled out an absentee ballot and simply said on that ballot that they didn't have an ID number to include. So that's grounds for a lawsuit. And if there's a lawsuit, one of the things the court's going to care about is what the words of the amendment mean, and they might even care about what the legislature meant when they passed this. So the question is, does the current absentee ballot verification system, is that substantially equivalent to the photo ID requirement in your constitutional amendment proposal?
Representative Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Representative Winkler. As to the two classes of voters, right now we have pre-registered voters who go through a lot of requirements. They pre-register, they take the time to do that. Their eligibility, they go through eligibility verification, and then they come to vote on Election Day. Those currently who register to vote on Election Day also go through verification. But that class of voters goes through it after their ballot is cast. After their ballot is cast. And so the questions that arise here have to do with, in the polling place on Election Day, we have two classes of voters, those who pre-registered and those who registered to vote on Election Day. In either case, either of those would be required to present their photo identification. The courts have upheld the substantially equivalent approach in regards to absentee ballots. And I'm confident that next year that we already have absentee balloting process, that the example that's been given here right now, and that we apply the substantially equivalent, that working together as Democrats and Republicans, that we will be able to apply the substantially equivalent standard in concert with the already passed U.S. Supreme Court and other courts upholding those accommodations. And I'm confident we will do that.
Representative Winkler.
Madam Chair, I just like to comment that you are, Representative Kiffmeyer is proposing a constitutional amendment but refuses to answer a direct question about the meaning of the amendment that she's proposing. So I want to move on to another section. Line 1.18, it says, the state must issue photographic identification at no charge to an eligible voter. And the question is, what in your opinion does no charge mean? Would that include supporting documents like a birth certificate? Would that include at no charge the variance process? Would that include at no charge an expedited fee? Is there some meaning to at no charge that we should be operating under if this were to pass?
Representative Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative Winkler. At no charge, to me, would looking at this, that if it's a free ID, whether it's regular or expedited, that would be no charge. As far as the waiver process, that is something that I would support as a legislator to consider, that we would also waive that $10 variance fee, and I think that that is something that could be reasonable. In another state, they have done such a thing as doing that as well, that direct fee connected to getting the ID.
Representative Winkler.
Madam Chair, Representative Kiffmeyer, we did better on that one. At least I understand that your intention is that it would actually truly be free, and I assume that would include the state funding birth certificates and so forth, because that was part of my question as well. And then the last point, you brought up the necessity of education about the ID requirement, the constitutionality requirement under the federal Constitution, and there is no provision for voter education in your amendment. So it seems to me that if, for some reason, the legislature failed to provide voter education about this ID requirement, we would be subject to our constitutional language being stricken by the Supreme Court, or the application of the voter ID law blocked by a federal court because there hadn't been education. Have you deliberately left out the requirement of voter education from the constitutional language? Because I'm afraid that just, creates very fertile ground for a lawsuit.
Representative Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Representative Winkler. That is one good thing that is in this legislation is a delayed effective date to give the legislature time to act quickly and make sure that there is the funding of the voter education effort, and also working with all of the groups and the entities in regards to getting the message out, whether it be by radio, by TV, by working with other advocacy groups, and I would be able to work with them as well. And so I think there's a lot of good activity. There's lots of people in the room today that can all work together to get the word out, whether it is through paid efforts or through word of mouth and other agency and entities. There's lots of goodwill here in the state of Minnesota for everybody to work together to make sure that anybody who does not currently have an ID is able to get an ID and to get that information out there. So, Representative Winkler, we have time to do that.
Representative Winkler?
Well, Madam Chair, Representative Kiffmeyer, the reason I asked about absent the substantially equivalent standard, the at-no-charge language, and why voter education wasn't in there is because when you take a constitutional approach, when you try to put something like this into the Constitution instead of into statute or into law, you are inviting legal challenges. And I suspect that by going down this path, we are going to find ourselves long before the 2013 election or the effective date, we're going to be in federal court, and we may even be in state court on the ballot question issue long before that. And by pursuing a constitutional amendment, you're creating the opportunity for voters to challenge everything that we do with regard to elections, everything we do with regard to the education efforts, everything we do with regard to what at-no-charge means, our definition of substantially equivalent. Those, by putting it in the Constitution, you give everybody a civil rights claim against the state of Minnesota if there is some error in how we do this. And I think it's a terrible mistake to do that. I'm looking forward to hearing from the testimony of the Secretary of State and others. And I really, from the point of view of somebody who wants voter certainty, this approach is going to cause lawsuits, it's going to cause voter confusion, and it's going to cause a lot of election uncertainty and even chaos. And there's a reasonable chance it will never become effective because of that. And you are inviting it by doing it this way. And the failure to answer basic questions about it, I think, just points to how kind of squishy this whole constitutional amendment that you've drafted really is. And the more you hedge on your answers, the more fertile the ground is for legal challenge. And so you better be very clear what you want and what the voters are choosing to do. Otherwise, you are just going to find yourself in an endless array of federal lawsuits.
Okay, now I'd like to have Mr. Secretary of State Ritchie. Stop. No clapping, please. Welcome to the committee again, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Members, my name is Mark Ritchie. I have the honor of serving you as Secretary of State. I know the time is short. I don't want to spend any time on the aspect that has been the main focus so far, the question of what will happen with those 84,000 people who have been voting for years and years but who do not have IDs is not known. If 1/3 are denied, it's 24,000. If it's 1%, it's 800. That would be going to the Minnesota Supreme Court. It's not something that we can predict here today. I want to focus on some of the other major elements of the proposed constitutional amendment because there are actually three very radical changes to our state election system proposed and anticipated. And I want to focus with my shortest time on the proposal to create a new parallel election system called provisional balloting because we do not have this, and this is a very significant change. Senator Newman and I testified on the Senate side last week, and we talked about this in our testimony. His proposal and the way he described it in testimony was that the 550,000 people who currently use Election Day registration to update their address or to change their name if their marital status are changed would simply vote by provisional ballot, and then the following day the local election official would begin the process of substantially equivalent verification in terms of eligibility. We use about 9 different data matches and data exchanges depending on the circumstance, but they come from various places. They come from Department of Vehicle Services, obviously, Social Security Administration, the National Death Registry, the Minnesota Department of Public Health, the Minnesota Department of Public Safety for information on citizenship, the Department of Corrections, of course, from the courts, of course, and from the U.S. Postal Service. We use them for both looking at their national change of address information, but also with a non-forwardable postcard that we use. So those local election officials would start the process of attempting to substantially equally verify their eligibility. They would need to do that quickly because the provisional balloting period, some states is 3 days. Senator Newman had originally proposed 10 days. Typically a week is often the discussion. But however long it takes, this would be a very difficult task, take a tremendous amount of time and money at the local level, probably cannot be done. Certainly the postcard cannot be done. So we would need to eliminate some of the current measures we use to verify the eligibility of our voters. Certainly the postcard, which is in fact our most important one at the final moment, but perhaps some of the others as well that could not be done physically or financially in that short of a time. But our citizens would be on pins and needles. 550,000 ballots or more would be sitting and not known if they were going to be counted or not. This does not, of course, include any of the 131,000 people who have the wrong address who would be voting provisional, the 10 or 20,000 people who've lost their wallet who would be voting provisional. It doesn't include those folks. It's just the people who've been using Election Day registration in presidential years. So this procedure is a radical change to our election system, and I think we need to think about it carefully. If, in fact, we want a provisional system and use that to eliminate Election Day registration, we should say that out loud and we should debate that. I'm being sued this week individually and in my capacity to eliminate the Election Day registration system. I know there are some people who want to do that. But I hear legislators, I hear citizens saying, no, that's not what we want. This was put to a vote of the citizens of Maine recently, and 61% said, no, this is not what we want. But if we do want to replace Election Day registration with a provisional voting system, we should debate it clearly and make sure that the townships, towns, counties have the money they need to process 500,000 voter registrations through that complex system of verification that we do now, and to do it quickly and to do it with the same level of care and comprehensiveness that we use today. That part, the provisional voting system, I think is one of the most significant changes. Let me just say that the language that requires for substantially equivalent verification of both identity and eligibility will change how we do in-person and especially mail-in balloting from townships, overseas voting, and of course absentee voting in general. These issues of how we work out a substantially equivalent or identical or nearly identical, these will change how we do absentee voting in Minnesota, but especially they will change how we do mail-in voting, which comes from primarily our townships. Madam Chair, there's a whole lot of things to say about this, but in the interest of time, please let me end there and take any questions. And I would like your permission to submit additional testimony if that's appropriate after the fact.
Okay. Are there questions? Representative Quam.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Ritchie, are you familiar with the opinion by Justice Stevens in the I guess you would call it Crawford v. Marion County Election Board in regards to the voter ID in, I believe it's Indiana?
Madam Chair, Representative,
Secretary?
yes, I have all 6 of those various Supreme Court rulings from Missouri and Indiana, the U.S. Supreme Court, and I can get them out if that would be useful.
Representative Quam.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Specifically when I'm reviewing them, and as you stated, there are 6, so that was part of the, I was trying to make sure I was referring to the correct one. In there is a section statement, as the Carter-Baker report observed, the electoral system cannot inspire public confidence if no safeguards exist to deter or detect fraud or to confirm the identity of the voters. That was on page 13 of the copy I have, which might not correspond. But then on page 14, it states The availability of the right to cast a provisional ballot provides an adequate remedy. And I think with some of the concerns brought up, those two statements go to the heart of, the intent of this amendment. And, since, as you stated, this has been before the Supreme Court, and we do have precedent in case law on this, I guess I'm confused with some of the objections before us today.
Secretary Ritchie?
Madam Chair, Representative, thank you so much for bringing these points up because they do go to the heart of the proposal. And since Minnesota not only is number one in the nation in voter turnout and trust in our system, but we are 6 percentage points ahead of the state that is number 2 in election turnout, it is a testament to how much our citizens trust and respect and how they feel about our system. We are by far the number 1 state because people trust our system. Indiana's voting in the 50s. We're voting in the high 70s. So we are an extraordinary place in terms of people's trust and participation in the system. But we can always make that system better. So, for example, if we would like visual verification of voters in the polling place, which actually is a good idea for a variety of different reasons, but you can do this very, very cheaply or for free by using the DMV system and bringing it into the polling place. We've talked about this briefly. I'd love some other time to be more precise and to show how that would be done. But that could be done with visual verification without disenfranchising anybody, without breaking the bank, and without triggering the kind of lawsuits and the oversight and all the things that come from the national level. Because the Supreme Court has ruled that not only provisional ballots are needed, but also the type of public education we've discussed, it also triggers then the federal oversight. Whenever you move to provisional balloting, you trigger federal laws that watch out and watch over that. And when you eliminate Election Day registration, you also trigger the motor voter law, which comes out of a completely different but also a federal act. So triggering the adoption of provisional ballots will trigger federal oversight. Getting rid of Election Day registration would also trigger oversight as well.
Representative Quam.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Ritchie, you brought it, stated disenfranchisement, et cetera. I believe that disenfranchisement was a major component in the litigation, and that it was not found to be present, and that's why the voter ID, photo ID, was upheld. Did you have a similar statute verbiage that was not upheld due to disenfranchisement that reached the U.S. Supreme Court?
Secretary Ritchie?
Madam Chair, Representative Quam, Indiana's a very interesting case because, of course, there were the famous 9 nuns who were denied the right to vote. There was a number of people who were denied the right to vote. And in that case now, they've begun trying to examine in Indiana what has been the impact. But, of course, the Indiana case is most famous because the judges said out loud, nobody brought any facts here. We don't have any time. We don't have material to rule from. But they also put in specific language about what must be met for something to meet their constitutional question. But when it was brought in front of the state court, so for example, most election law is administered and run at the state level and governed by state constitutional measures. Whether a felon is allowed to vote or not is a state matter. North Dakota, felons can vote once they're out of prison. Minnesota cannot. So those state Supreme Court rulings have had a tremendous effect on how photo ID and other pieces of election law have been administered in the country, and certainly that would be the case in Minnesota as well. For instance, as a result of the recount, our Minnesota Supreme Court looked at every single case where somebody's vote, which they were an eligible voter, but their vote had been denied, and they took a very harsh view of that, and they issued rulings that made it clear that they wanted every single vote counted if the person was eligible. So we don't know when a case might go to the U.S. Supreme Court that spells out the people who were not able to vote. But we are imagining that in the case of Minnesota, this might happen sooner rather than later. My point is that if the issue is visual verification of voters, there are some very inexpensive and very secure systems to do that, if that's what we would like to do.
Mr. Secretary, I have a question on something that you'd said in one of your other comments. You said, and I don't want to misquote you, but this is the gist of what I got, that Minnesota has higher voter turnout than other states, and that's proof that the people trust the system. I think you said something to that effect. And I'm just wondering what evidence you have, or what leads you to conclude that the reason our voters vote more is because they trust our system.
Madam Chair, the experience of the 30,000 people who serve as our local election officials and of the 1,000 or so who are our county auditors, town clerks, township clerks, and others, it's in their administration of this election that people find their confidence in our system. And it's constantly the kind of feedback loop that we get is because we trust in the system, that's why we turn out in very high numbers. It is also argued that our Election Day registration system adds to our turnout, and I often add that we have at least 6 active political parties, and that helps bring some other people as well. But mainly, this conversation comes up around people saying, if we do not adopt these proposals, we will, be one of the lowest voting states in the nation, or we need to adopt these proposals because we have so many people not voting. But when we compare ourselves to any other state in the nation, we are so far ahead of any other state that whatever are all the different reasons, people in Minnesota trust in their system, believe in their system, and have consistently been number one in voting for a long period of time. We could ask the University of Minnesota to poll people. Why do you think Minnesota is number one in the nation? Why are we 6 percentage points ahead of Wisconsin? I would be very interested to hear the results of that kind of polling. But when somebody says to me, if we don't adopt a constitutional amendment, Minnesota won't have a good voter turnout, our experience doesn't show us that is necessarily true.
Well, Mr. Secretary, you talked about feedback. Maybe you could talk more about who that feedback is from. As you probably know, there have been several polls, I think, throughout the country. I think there was a state fair poll here, and those poll numbers show that 70 or more % support this language, this legislation. And I'm feeling a little bit of a disconnect when you say people are happy with the system as it is, but yet the polling numbers that I've seen aren't indicating that.
Madam Chair, I think that a simple question that's asked at the state fair, I think it was 54-46, something like that. But this proposal is not a proposal about showing photo ID. This is a proposal to replace Election Day registration with provisional balloting. It's a proposal to create a giant new parallel system. It's a proposal to extend the time that we take to be able to announce unofficial and official results to anything up to 10 days. So I think what we're asking is, do we want a radical change in our system? And that question might be on the ballot, and it will be hotly debated.
Madam Chair,
Representative Kiffmeyer.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. After these repeated statements, I think it's really important to speak to this. There's nothing in this constitutional amendment that does away with Election Day registration. It does not. And matter of fact, what's radical as far as Minnesota and other states is our vouching. We're one of 2 states as compared to the numerous other states that do have ID requirements. And those requirements being upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court, supported by President Jimmy Carter, Andrew Young, Justice Stevens. These are well-known folks who do that. And again, Election Day registration. I think it's important to note that the large majority of Election Day registrants do have an ID. And with our voter education efforts, we will have the large number of people on Election Day voting as they usually do. That is very allowable within this constitutional amendment. As a matter of fact, in Indiana, in numerous studies, voter ID turnout went up, and especially amongst Democrat voting areas.
Mr. Ritchie, on that issue, when you talked about and I'm confused by the two conflicting responses there, and you said this does away with same-day registration, I think you said. Where exactly does it say that? And could you clarify how that, I'm not understanding how you're seeing that. Could you clarify the line that it does that?
Yes, Madam Chair. In our testimony on the Senate side on this exact same language, it was asked to Senator Newman, how would it work, Election Day registration? And he said, well, then people who registered on Election Day could not cast or count their ballot. They would cast a provisional ballot. And then the next day, the provisions of the substantially equivalent verification would kick in, and they would have to be verified starting the next day. So you could register, you just couldn't cast a vote.
Mr. Secretary, you are looking at the DE1 amendment, which is different than what was heard in the Senate, correct?
Yeah.
Could you just point to the line,
Yes.
so that we were all on the same page, the line that says that? You could identify that?
Is it 1.13? All voters must be subject to substantially equivalent identity and eligibility verification prior to a ballot being cast or counted. So a person coming in on Election Day, let's say the 550,000 people on Election Day, their voter registration would need to have their eligibility verification be substantially equivalent to people who had registered prior to the election. We use 8 or 9, depending on the process, verifications. And Senator Newman was absolutely right. The people could register, but they couldn't vote because they would not have been verified, much less on a substantially equivalent basis on Election Day. And what he said was they would vote provisionally, and those provisional ballots would then be processed by local election officials starting the next day. So there may be ways to drop out the requirement that their registration be verified, but there may not be.
Well, Mr. Secretary, thank you. I just urge you to be careful with your language, because I thought I'd heard you saying this does away with same-day registration. It might make it more difficult. I'm not sure it says exactly what you are.
Madam
and I
Chair?
just want to remind you that this is the DE1 and not the same Senate language.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for that clarification. I think it's fair to say you could register, but you couldn't cast a ballot.
I'll move on. Representative Sanders.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for being here today, Mr. Secretary. I do appreciate it. I guess I respectfully disagree with your reading, and perhaps even Senator Newman's, although he be the Senate author. Line 1.14 says, starting on 1.13, all voters must be subject to substantially equivalent identity. So whether that be if you, for whatever reason, you cannot show a photo ID, if you're voting absentee, you can't show your ID to yourself, right? So you have to be, have substantially equivalent identity. And eligibility verification prior to a ballot being cast or counted. The next section on 1.16 says a voter in a polling place on Election Day must present a valid government-issued photographic identification before receiving a ballot. I don't see anything in here. In fact, what it tells me is that if anyone walks into a polling place with a valid government-issued photographic identification card or substantially equivalent proof of identity, but more so in the polling place on Election Day, to your comments of same-day registration, if you walk in and have a valid government identification card, you can prove that identity, and it can be verified before you receive the ballot. You go into the ballot box, you then vote, and your ballot is cast. I don't see, I guess, where the disconnect is there if you meet these requirements as an eligible voter. Could you explain that to me, please?
Secretary Ritchie.
Yeah, Madam Chair, Representative Sanders, thank you so much for that question. The issue is eligibility verification. We have a 9-step process of eligibility verification. So if you're one of the 550,000 who register on Election Day, it's not possible to do all 9 steps of that verification on Election Day. And election officials would have to go to work very quickly the next day to complete all of those processes. You could take that out. You could have it not based on eligibility verification, it just have identity. That would be a change.
Madam Chair.
Representative Kiffmeyer.
I'm sorry. I think, Madam Chair, it's really important to recognize when you have some of these statements, it's taking a scenario where Secretary Ritchie has already talked about a technology that could be useful in this way, and he's already supported that, and he already has some of those things. And are we really going to foster unequal treatment of voters where those who pre-register go through this process, those on Election Day do it afterwards? But meantime, but I think he's already supported a very efficient and quite workable method to accomplish this in a way that speeds the election process and accomplishes all of this. So I appreciate his bringing forth some sort of technology that will help with that. I just thought he might have forgotten to have mentioned it and want to be sure that he himself has already acknowledged there's a way to accomplish this very efficiently.
Mr. Secretary?
Madam Chair, Representative Kiffmeyer, thank you very much for bringing up that alternative for visual verification. I do think it's a great idea. I think it has a lot of promise. But I also want to agree with you very much that we do not want to create 2 systems so that people that 550,000 who register on Election Day are not subject to the equally or substantially equal verification. They would need to be, as Senator Newman said, voting provisionally, and then those provisional ballots would need to sit until their registration had been verified under a substantially equivalent procedure. We can speed it up. We can add staff. We could drop the non-forwardable postcard. We could drop the National Death Registry, which is a whole complicated process. We could weaken our standards for eligibility verification and speed it up. But I agree with Secretary Kiffmeyer. We don't want 2 different standards. And the only way to handle that under this constitutional amendment is, as Senator Newman stated over on his side, those 550,000 would vote provisionally, and they would get handled the next day or the next few days.
Can I just interrupt with a question, and then I'll go back to Representative Sanders. The 9-step, you said it was the 9-step eligibility process. When people vouch for other people, and I believe in Minnesota, I can vouch for 15 people. If I want, I can bring them in my bus or whatever and vouch for them. Do you go through the 9-step process for those people that are vouched for as well?
Madam Chair, yes, ma'am.
Okay. Representative Sanders.
Madam Chair, that was almost my question. Mr. Secretary, for those that register on the same day right now, do they have to go through that 9-step process within that next following day or the next few days for same-day registrants now?
And when you answer that, Mr. Secretary, maybe you could just talk about the 9-step process, too, and how that works.
Madam Chair, thank you very much. I'd love to. It typically takes months. So the answer directly, Representative Sanders, is no, it does not happen the next day or the next few days. It takes quite a while. And the process is that a voter registration card is data entered at the local level. If it has the driver's license number, that information is sent to Driver and Vehicle Services to verify that it's the same person, same address, same driver's license number. If there is any problem with that or it's not available, then the last 4 digits of the Social Security are used to go to the U.S., to the Federal Social Security Administration to try to do the same form of verification. If neither one can be verified, it's flagged and that information is forwarded to the people at the county level. And then once that process is done, then there's sort of 2 paths. One is the sending of a non-forwardable postcard, because typing errors can occur and all kinds of things can happen. And then the beginning of the of the determination of eligibility based on what Minnesota law or constitutional provisions require. So, for example, we get information from the courts about anyone who's lost their right to vote as a result of mental incompetence or some decision by the courts, and we get some information from them about people who've been convicted of felony counts, which then would disallow them from being able to participate in voting. But perhaps more importantly, we get information from the Department of Corrections, and in fact, in front of you this year is a bill to strengthen that for the information about who actually got sentenced on a felony count, because people do sometimes, it gets changed to a gross misdemeanor. So Department of Corrections is our most important source, and in the future they will be our key source on the question of felon voting, and when does a felon lose their right to vote, and when might they regain it as a result of completing their sentence. The next verification that we do is on the question of citizenship. Department of Public Safety has information in its files based on the question of, we call it status check, that on some driver's licenses, if you are in this country with a visa, that date is known, and that date is on your identification card, your permit, or your driver's license, if you happen to have that. Then we move to the question of people who've died, and this is actually something that I have a lot of personal concern about and work on and pay attention to. We use the state of Minnesota Department of Health because that's our most powerful source, and we can get that very quickly. But if a Minnesotan dies outside of the state, it's a much more complicated process. We use now, it's kind of expensive, but we do it. We use the National Death Registry, and we've been engaged in discussion with other states about doing something like we do with revoked commercial truck driver licenses, which is at midnight every night, the 50 states or so, comparing death data so that we can have very up-to-date data. So we're now using those two sources on death data, but we hope that there might be an even better source in the future. Then we have the two ways that we use the U.S. Postal Service. One I mentioned, the postal card. The second one is that we run addresses against the national change of address data that we receive. I think it's on a monthly basis from the U.S. Postal Service in case somebody has moved. So all of those steps are done. If there are a flag, if there's a problem at any level, this information goes to the county official. Only the county official can make a change. So if it's a Jim Johnson, they're notified there's a Jim Johnson, and they have to determine, is that the Jim Johnson on their list who died? So that final decision is happening down at the county level. But that's what the current system for eligibility verification looks like. We've made proposals to strengthen that in terms of felon voting, which has been moving ahead on both sides of the legislature. So this system of verification, eligibility verification, we hope will be strengthened on the felon voting side this year, and we're always looking for ideas, suggestions of ways to make it even stronger going forward.
Okay, well, I have a follow-up to that. I'm still trying to understand this 9-step eligibility process, and I'm wondering if that's something that you could pass out to us, that when we listen to the witnesses, we have a better understanding. And then the other thing, and maybe perhaps you could do this now, I'm still really confused about this 9-step eligibility process, because when I've seen people vouched for, it doesn't seem like it takes a whole lot of time, and I'm wondering if you could walk me through. So if I come in and I bring Representative Simon, and I say, I know Representative Simon, he lives in this precinct, but he doesn't have any identification. How does that, the 9-step eligibility process work, if you could just take me through that step by step?
Madam Chair, this eligibility process starts when the voter registration form lands at it goes to the city and to the county. It starts at that process. So the verification that happens on Election Day is the process that we use for just any form of same-day or Election Day registration, and this process kicks in. On vouching itself, there's two vouching. There's vouching done by staff of residential facilities, nursing home, people who are in large-scale facility, and then there's the vouching that's done by a registered voter in the precinct of a person they have personal knowledge of in their precinct who has moved, but their license doesn't reflect their new address. Maybe it's the 2nd of November or it's very soon thereafter. And the person vouching for them swears on an oath that they know them and that they are living in the precinct, and their proof of their knowledge and their swearing to this subjects them to the possibility of being prosecuted for lying, which is a felony in the state of Minnesota. And it has occasionally occurred that this has happened and people are prosecuted for a felony. That person is filling out a voter registration form, and the vouching person is vouching that they, in fact, live in that precinct. The proposal that we've brought forward about using electronic poll books creates many excellent options for strengthening that procedure. For example, almost everyone being vouched on has a driver's license or something, but it has the wrong address. But they would already be in the Department of Motor Vehicle system, so they could just have their current license scanned. The vouching person would have their identification scanned or maybe a picture taken, whatever we wanted to do, and that would provide the information that's needed for doing the registration, the 9-step process once we're done on the next, on the next day of that person's registration path.
So does the person being vouched for have to make it through all these steps? And then if they're not, what happens? If there's not enough information, what exactly happens?
Madam Chair, yeah, they have to make it through all 9 paths, and if there's a flag on any case, then it's flagged. It goes either to prosecution via the county attorney, or it's flagged for if, in fact, it's something that's flagged. Let's say now you're a felon or something like that. It's on their file. It's on the poll book. When they come back into the polling place, it said, it looks to your challenge, it looks to us like you are a felon, that you've lost your right to vote. Have you completed your sentence totally, and are you then therefore eligible? And if the person claims they have, then they have to sign another affidavit, an oath that says, I'm now off my full sentence, and if I'm lying, I'm committing a new felony, and I'll be sent back to prison. I think it's 5 years in that case. So there's a set of procedures. It's also the same if somebody mails in a voter registration form. They have a driver's license number, or they have last 4 of their social, and it's the same procedure for those as well.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. And perhaps if you could allow us to see those 9 steps. And just a question on that, too. And I'm sorry, I know there are other members that have questions, and so I'll try to limit my comments to Mr. Secretary. But I guess my question is, for the people that are the same-day registrants, I guess if you could just line those 9 steps up with the vouching process, because I'm having a really hard time understanding how that works, if you wouldn't mind. Anyway, I'll move on to
Madam Chair, if I could.
Representative Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think it's really important to fit into this the context and in this kind of questioning that you have and the answer to that. What's important to realize is that those who pre-register go through those 9 steps, whatever they may be, prior to casting a ballot. When they come to vote on Election Day, if that verification shows that they are a felon or they're in a situation where they're not eligible, status check, that is noted on those rosters. And election judges on Election Day have that helpful information to enable them to make sure that they are eligible to vote. And they have that notation. But that is done prior to their getting a ballot. However, when it comes to vouching, the case you're talking about, they get the ballot first, and it is counted. And then afterwards, that happens. If afterwards they find out that they were not eligible, you can't take that ballot out of the ballot box. Yeah. It's in. And I think that's kind of the distinction I think you might have been asking about that I thought might be helpful clarification.
That is helpful. I'm going to move on then to other members. Next on my list is Representative Beard, followed by Representative Simon.
Madam Chair, we got a Secretary of State and a former one, so maybe we can get some clarification. This is a question I don't know the answer to, so this is going to be for light, Mr. Secretary or Representative. We talked about provisional balloting a moment ago. To be clear, do we have provisional balloting in this state now? Doesn't it exist, or does it?
Madam Chair.
Secretary?
I'm sorry, Madam Chair, Representative Beard, no.
Representative Beard.
I'm trying to understand then what I was witnessing in my precinct last election day, where we had, I just, in redistricting, I just lost 24,000 citizens, the largest district in the state of Minnesota, because of the huge influx. And, well, by the way, we welcome that. It's a good thing. But I remember in the presidential election, there were a lot of people walking in the door to register on the spot. And I thought there was if they didn't have clear identification or hadn't pre-registered, there was another system for handling their ballots. They got to vote. They got to mark a ballot on the spot, but it wasn't counted on the spot. Am I misunderstanding something there, or what did I miss?
Madam Chair.
Representative Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Representative Beard, Madam Chair. Sometimes there is no provisional balloting in Minnesota at this time. However, the provisional ballot envelope, that exterior envelope, can be very much like an absentee ballot, but it's in the polling place, so we don't currently have that. In some polling places, absentee ballots are brought there on Election Day and kept by the election judges and sometimes counted there, or absentee ballot boards, but Minnesota law allows for that. So you might have seen that as something like that, but we don't have provisional ballots.
Representative Beard.
I think I see one more response here that might shed a little more light for me and make me a little smarter about this.
Madam Chair, Representative Beard, after the 2008 election, the law was changed, and so all absentee ballot processing is done centrally now at the county level. So probably that might have been 08, and then 10, it was changed and was a really great change, really excellent change in our system.
So, Madam Chair,
Representative Beard.
Then that does give me a little pause. When we had, literally, I think there were 700 or 800 people walk up that day claiming to live in the precinct, many of them showing their citizenship card because they were new citizens and excited to vote and this kind of stuff. But the ones that did not, that were vouched for, either said, well, trust me, I live here, here's my electric bill, they were just mingled in with the rest of the ballots and right out of the chute. Is that what I'm understanding?
Mr. Ritchie.
Madam Chair, Representative Beard, that's right.
Okay.
And it is one of the things that we imagine with some of the new technology, really being able to use the available, like Department of Motor Vehicle database that exists on some of these things. And I would really welcome a deeper conversation about those particular points, at some point, not today, but at some point.
And I think they would, Madam Chair, be worth discussing. But thank you. That gives me something to think about. Thank you.
Representative Simon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm glad that we had a discussion just a little bit earlier about Indiana and about what is or isn't radical, because I'd like to talk about that a little bit while we have both Secretary Ritchie and Representative Kiffmeyer here. And I think something that's been lost in this discussion is that we are talking about a constitutional amendment. This is a big deal. Representative Erdahl, Representative Beard, others who have been here a long time, we don't normally, that is until recently, do these all the time. Now apparently we do. So we're taking strong policy preferences, which don't need to be in the Constitution, and putting them in the Constitution. I did some research, and if you look at NCSL, it's all there on their website. There are 31 states with some sort of voter ID requirement. 8 have sort of the hard requirement, as Mitt Romney might say, the severely conservative requirement, and that's what this would be. Then another 7 have a photo ID requirement, but it doesn't have to be government issued. It could be your, fitness club card, or it could be some other photo ID card. And then there are another 16 states that have some ID requirement, but not necessarily a photo. It can be a utility bill or something else. So 31 states. Only one state in the country, only one, has done this by constitutional amendment, and that's Mississippi. So now our one peer, if we pass this, will be the state of Mississippi. Even conservative states with conservative legislators, thoughtful, serious people like we have here, who are trying to do something that they feel strongly about, even they showed the self-discipline and the self-restraint not to put a simple policy preference in the Constitution. That's not what we're seeing here. We are seeing really the opposite of conservatism, the opposite of self-discipline, of self-restraint, and of not doing what feels good. What we are seeing here is constitutionalizing policy differences. And by doing that, we're basically writing in permanent ink. We are putting very serious subject matters beyond the reach of future legislatures from all practical purposes. We are imposing our will on future generations in a way that a statute doesn't. We've heard today a lot of technical issues with a very technical subject matter. We've heard a lot of definitions that we don't know about. We've heard that this is not a simple thing. I know how this issue polls, and I understand why it polls that way. People aren't dumb or wrong for telling a pollster that they think this might be a good idea on its surface. But there's a lot more to it than that. I think we would all agree. And by putting these things and these definitions in the Constitution, never to be changed again unless by another constitutional amendment, I think we're really, really playing with fire here. And I think we have to think about that. Phrases like substantially equivalent, at no charge, provisional balloting, these are not defined here. And I really ask people, particularly the more senior legislators in the room, I named two already, to really think about what you're doing here. Do you really want to start this arms race, by the way? And I don't mean this to be partisan and not to be, but for the last 4 years, when Democrats were in charge, Democrats showed some self-discipline and self-restraint. Talk to former Speaker Kelleher about the number of times interest groups and partisans approached her about putting things in the Constitution to get around Governor Pawlenty. And she said no. And she was right to say no, because you don't monkey around with the Constitution unless you absolutely have to. So I'm just warning people, and this shouldn't get partisan, but I am warning you that if you do this, you did it already once last year and you're doing it again, if you do this, there will be no restraint. Very little restraint, I fear, and I do fear it because I don't cheer it. There will be very little restraint or no restraint the next time Democrats get control of the House or Senate. And why ought there be? Why should there be? So I urge you between now and when this gets to the floor, because we know the result here, I hope the senior grown-up voices in the room, in your caucus, and I mean that respectfully, it's not sarcastic. I mean the people who I think a great deal of, and you know who you are, Representative Beard and Erdahl and others, but not just senior members. I hope you really, behind closed doors, we don't have to see it, you don't have to put out a press release, I hope you can talk some sense into some of your colleagues who feel very strongly about an issue, and I respect that. I respect the differences we have here. Very thoughtful people can have differences of opinion here, but I hope you who perhaps are more senior around here or otherwise can really impress upon your colleagues the arms race that you're starting here, because there won't be any restraint like there was in the 4 years that Democrats had control of the House and Senate. I can guarantee you that restraint, that self-discipline, that small c conservatism, if you will go out the window, and I don't think you want to go there. So if you want inflation-adjusted minimum wage, or you want a Buffett rule, or you want a right to health care, or a right to privacy in the Constitution, all things that people on the left want to do and feel very strongly about, and poll very, very well. If you ask somebody and they told a pollster, of course I'm for the right to privacy or a right to health care. Just watch it. Just watch it. And I hope you have a very fruitful discussion in your closed-door caucus meetings about that.
Well, Senator Simon? This is going to take a lot longer if people aren't cooperative. And I appreciate your comments, Representative Simon. I would like to point out, when you talked about the states that didn't do this constitutionally, I will point out that we did pass this in the legislature last year statutorily, and the governor did veto the legislation. So I just wanted to make that clear as well. I'm going to move on to the next person, and please save your comments for later, because I know there are a lot of people that want to testify. So if they're just comments, if you could just save them for later. Representative Erdahl.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And before I ask a question, just a comment. Representative Simon, I think you made some good points there. Now, I'm going to support this constitutional amendment. But I do fear governing by constitutional amendment as a long-term position of the legislature. I actually have had a bill drafted, not introduced, to require a supermajority to do a constitutional amendment of the legislature. So, I mean, this is a concern that I don't think we should run rampant with constitutional amendments. That said, a lot of members do, for whatever reason, introduce them. I've been told that every current Democrat in the legislature now has either authored or co-authored a constitutional amendment. So I think that restraint is an important thing that we all should do. That said, there likely will be a couple on the ballot this year. We've already passed one, and I'm expecting that this one will be there as well. So now my question, and whichever of the former secretary, the current secretary, could answer. A lot of concern has been expressed about what the impact on voter turnout will be if this passes. And, with Indiana, Florida, Georgia, the states that do have this, do you know what the impact has been on voter turnout before the passage of photo ID and after?
Secretary Ritchie?
Madam Chair, Representative Verdall, first, we have a short sheet with the little 9 different double checks, and it wasn't prepared for this particular purpose, but I would recommend it, and we will prepare a more thoughtful, maybe a little PowerPoint that shows how it works, but this is for the moment. Representative Verdall, no state with a high turnout has made this kind of change, moved to provisional balloting, changed dramatically election day registration, that sort of thing. So we don't have much to look at. In the 2008 election, we know there was a big boost in turnout throughout the entire country. Minnesota got up to 78%, and I think the next state was 72, was Wisconsin. So we know that there are a lot of different factors, and that was a highly energized election. We know that from just all the statistics about it. But we'll be curious to see the effects in a state like Mississippi, which is not a very high voting state, but they also have passed a constitutional amendment. Wisconsin is a high voting state, and they have recently passed legislatively a similar proposal, although the courts are now holding that, and it's being challenged in court. So Wisconsin might be a model or some kind of guide. But generally speaking, the rise and fall of turnout in Minnesota has never been kind of heavily changing one way or the other. Presidential years were 77, 78%. Non-presidential years were 56 or so %, and we're typically number one. And there's probably not a lot that can happen that can move that up or down much, except over a long period of time, because we've been at those levels, for quite a while.
Madam Chair.
Representative Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, and Representative Verdall, members. On this, there have been many, many studies. As you know, an issue like this has been studied greatly, not only from the beginning of the photo ID first statutory law that we know so well in Indiana, that state, many subsequent years, and those studies show consistently that voter turnout increases, and especially amongst Democrats, especially in the state of Indiana. So some folks have said, well, then why are you sponsoring this if it might even increase Democrat turnout? And I said, because it is the right thing to do. Proof of your identity and your eligibility, all these things are already constitutionally required in the state of Minnesota. They're just part of that. And I think that if we can increase voter turnout some more, and even from the Democrats, I'm all for increasing voter turnout.
Madam Chair, Representative Verdall, I completely agree with Secretary Kiffmeyer. Anything we can do to increase turnout would be great. But one thing about introducing provisional ballots is that, on average, only 2/3 are ever counted. So if we could increase turnout, that would be fantastic. That would be unprecedented in history. But moving to provisional ballots means that, roughly speaking, 1/3 on average are not counted. If we had 600,000 provisional ballots, we would have 200,000 that weren't counted. Minnesota is typically above average. We all know that. So if you only had 10% that were uncounted, it would reduce our counted votes by about 60,000. So we're not only looking at a constitutional amendment that's about photo identification. I think that's a misnomer in a way. We're looking at a constitutional amendment to create a brand new parallel election system to dramatically change the ability of people who register on Election Day. They would have to be casting ballots that would be provisional, and changing in how we handle our mail-in ballots, whether they're absentee overseas or mail-in precincts. And so the change to our system is not simply something that's on one particular thing. It's a very comprehensive change to our system. Provisional voting in Indiana, I think only 17% were actually counted that were provisionally voted as a result of the photo ID requirement. I'm hoping that a state like Minnesota would do better, but 2/3 is the average nationwide that's counted, so you have to figure about a third won't be counted. And in Minnesota, as good as we are, 3% of our absentee voters do not fill in the paperwork properly, and their ballots are disallowed. So if you have a large number of people voting provisionally with paperwork similar to absentee voting, on average about 3% of us won't do it right. Those ballots also won't be counted. That will again affect our actual turnout of votes that are counted. More people will cast ballots provisionally and that sort of thing, but because a percentage of them will not be allowed, our actual recorded vote could go down.
Okay, members, I have several members still on the list, but unfortunately we also have a lot of people here to testify. So this is my suggestion for game plan. I think we should go till 12:25, get as many witnesses done as we can. Then we'll come back tonight at 6 o'clock in room 10, or 6 o'clock, or 15 minutes after session if session runs past 6 o'clock, if that is okay with everyone. Is there anyone, do any of the members have a specific question they need to ask Mr. Secretary Ritchie, or Ms. Frazier will be here tonight, I understand, as well, to take questions. Okay. So we'll move on to the next phase. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. We'll move on to the next phase, and again, we're going to be holding up time cards, and the reason we're doing that is because we have such a long list of witnesses, it would be unfair to allow any one person to go longer than the allotted time. We have asked that only one person per organization testify. If you want to do 2 persons per organization, then it will be only 1 minute per person, or a total of 2 minutes per person, or per organization. The first on the list is Minnesota Council of Nonprofits. I have Susie Brown and Jeff Narrabrook, and then if the next person could get on deck, that's Sally Fine Day, and then after that, Kenza Haj Masa will be on deck. Is the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits here to testify? Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Jeff Narrabrook with the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, and it's just me today. We're a statewide association of 2,000 nonprofits, many of which you probably know. I venture most, if not all of you, have volunteered in a nonprofit in your own community or donated to charitable causes you support, and you know that the nonprofit sector is really about building strong communities. Strong communities depend on actively engaged voters. Consider some of the voters nonprofits are seeing every day. A woman who's left a violent partner and is living in a shelter. Maybe a voter who's lost their home and is living in a shelter. Maybe an elderly person who's moved into a nursing home shortly before election. These are all circumstances in which obtaining a photo ID before Election Day or after having cast a provisional ballot may not be practical for the voter. Now, our current system has some safeguards, such as allowing domestic violence shelter staff to vouch for their residents. And that reflects the reality in our society that people and voters find themselves in a variety of life stations, a variety of life circumstances. And this bill really eliminates some of those safeguards and replaces it with a very simple one-size-fits-all approach that just doesn't fit everybody's life. And unless an exemption is added to the constitutional amendment itself, we're afraid that the exemptions you may actually want to be making won't be available to you later as legislators, and that's including nursing home residents. We don't see anything in this language that suggests that a nursing home resident will be exempt from showing a photo ID. They may be able to be vouched for their residency, but they're still going to have an ID, as they did in last year's bill as well. In the end, we think this is a distraction from the real civic problem we face. We're proud about our voter turnout, but do you know how many didn't vote in 2010? 1.6 million eligible Minnesotans didn't vote in 2010. We think that's the real problem we want to address. We want to keep going forward with ways to increase participation and reduce barriers, and we look forward to working on those solutions. For all those reasons, we oppose this amendment, and I'd like to pass out a handout. I have exemptions that other states have done in their photo ID bills that we don't have here. Thank you. And
Thank you very much. We'll move on to Sally Finde, then after that Kenzahaj Moza, and then Jana Curran. And everybody, please remember to state your name for the record and your organization if you're from one. And please look to Ms. Hanson for your time.
Good afternoon. My name is Sally Finde. I am a member with the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe, and I'm the Executive Director of Native Vote Alliance of Minnesota. Native Vote Alliance of Minnesota is a statewide nonprofit organization whose work largely entails educating American Indian citizens about their rights to vote and making them aware of how their vote counts. I have two issues that I bring to the table today. One is that apparently the language has totally disregarded a ruling by Judge James Rosenbaum in 2005 with the ACLU of Minnesota versus Mary Kiffmeyer case 04CV-4653. I'd really like to encourage this committee to take a look at that and really support all voters in Minnesota, including American Indian people, because this ruling identified the tribal identification cards as being acceptable identification, government-issued identification. Secondly, I'd like to say that the cost of living in rural Minnesota is really a lot more expensive than living here in the urban area. We don't have transportation. Lots of people are in economies where we are suffering and we don't have jobs. So for me, it would cost me an additional $55 to get to make sure that my vote is counted. For lots of other people that don't have the transportation, I'm estimating, just based on my own $55 times $48,000, that $2.6 million burden would be with the taxpayers. Thank you.
Thank you. Next on the list, Kenzahaj Moza, then Jana Corin, then Kathy Bonifield.
Thank you. My name is, Madam Chair and members of the committee, my name is Kenzahaj Moza. I'm here on behalf of the Minnesota Coalition for the Homeless. We represent over 150 member organizations across the state. Today is actually our lobby day, so you'll notice between 300 and 400 advocates from around the state for affordable housing. I became passionate about voting rights when I was working at a shelter in Minneapolis. It's part of our mission to end homelessness and rebuild lives. Shelter staff, volunteers, and residents work together on a voter engagement project. We registered eligible voters, talked about voting rights and responsibilities, and made sure everyone could get to the polls on Election Day. I'm asking you to protect your own constituents' rights to vote. Being allowed to vote without a place to call home, without a current ID, gives people faith in their state, gives them faith in their elected leaders. That's you. Over the years, I've come to realize just how fair our voting laws are, and they benefit the whole state. When somebody votes who's a millionaire or who's living in a shelter, they're saying that they care about themselves, they care about their community, and they care about their future. From the perspective of the hundreds of advocates and citizens who are here at the Capitol today, voter impersonation is not a problem. Families living in their cars in rural Minnesota is a problem. Veterans coming home from war and living under bridges in our cities, that's a problem. I'm sure you're not told this enough, but we really appreciate your public service and your commitment to the state, and we just strongly hope that you'll put jobs and housing as a priority over this constitutional amendment. Thank you.
Thank you. Next on the list is Jana Corin, and the time will start. If people clap, then the time will start, and it'll limit the amount of time the witness has to testify. Thank you. Welcome to the committee.
Hello. Madam Chair, members of the committee, my name is Jana Curran. I'm the Public Education Coordinator for the American Civil Liberties Union of Minnesota, an organization that has over 8,500 members throughout the state. This past Tuesday, on March 6th, a Wisconsin county judge stopped voter ID from going into effect in Wisconsin. In this decision, he wrote, "If no injunction is issued, a clearly improper impairment of a most vital element of our society will occur. The case has been made. Irreparable harm is likely to occur in the absence of injunction." So he has prevented voter ID from going forward. Voter ID has now been legally stopped in Wisconsin, Missouri, South Carolina, Mississippi, and Texas. Voting is a fundamental right protected by more amendments into the U.S. Constitution than any other amendment. This would place a burden on our voters by having a constitutional amendment to require an ID. I'm going to tell you a story now of my grandma. This is her right here. This is my grandma. Her name is Ramona Curran. She's 78 and she lives in Hawley, Minnesota. She recently downsized from her 3-bedroom apartment to a 1-bedroom apartment to cut back on expenses because she lives on a fixed income. At the same time she moved, she was denied a renewal for her driver's license because she could not pass the test. So she did not get a new ID card with her current address. She has no family who lives in town and no mode of transportation. She always votes, and if the election were held today, she would not be able to cast a ballot. While she was told about this, when I told her about this impending law, she said she had no idea they were even debating it and didn't understand why after voting consistently for her entire life, she would have to change how she voted. She's able to cash checks and do all her normal tasks without a current ID and didn't know she would even have to get one since she no longer can drive. While she remains very sharp in general, this idea frightened, she became very anxious at the idea of not being able to vote because it is so important on her. This is the burden we'll be placing on people. Thank you.
Okay, next on the list is Kathy Bonfield, and then after that we'll go to Ian O'Brien, and then after that Chris Bell.
I've been informed that there's some people from out of town, someone specifically from Duluth, and I'm willing to come back at 6 o'clock to testify so they can testify now and then go home later.
That's right. Just go ahead and do your testimony now. I think the person from Duluth is the next person on the list.
Perfect. My name is Kathy Bonifield, and I'm the Executive Director for Citizens for Election Integrity Minnesota. I'm here to speak against House File 2738. While I'm against a voter photo ID requirement, the specific concern I will speak about now is the sentence, all voters must be subject to substantially equivalent identity and eligibility verification prior to a ballot being cast or counted. All voters, no exemptions. If this passes, when a voter stands in front of an election judge, the judge would look at the photo ID, look at the voter, and confirm they're the same person. How can a by-mail voter who does not stand in front of an election judge have the same substantially equivalent verification standards as that of an in-person voter? This would mean that a Peace Corps volunteer who is serving in a rural community throughout the world, as well as the thousands of rural Minnesotans who vote in mail-in precincts, would be subject to the same substantially equivalent verification standards as someone in Minneapolis who walks up to the precinct and shows their ID to that election judge. It means that a woman who fled an abusive spouse with just the clothes on her back and her children leaving behind her valid photo ID would be subject to the same substantially equivalent verification standards as all other voters before her vote is cast or counted. Nothing is substantially equivalent to standing in front of an election judge. A recent research states that found that the states that have strict ID requirements also have exemptions. In Wisconsin, Peace Corps volunteers are exempted. Women in battered shelters are exempted. People living in nursing homes are exempted. I understand my time is over, but I have a document that I believe that Jeff had handed out that shows exemptions, and I also have a letter from the Overseas Vote Foundation expressing their concerns, and I hope you can read that.
Thank you very much. There are two people that wanted to testify from Emperg, so they will have a total of 2 minutes for both of them, and Ian O'Brien is one of them who needed to get back to Duluth. That's why they're up next. Yep.
Madam Chair, the point that was made about people from out of town, do we have a list of those people where they are? I mean, if we have people that can come back tonight, if we're going to be going at 6, that if there are people that can't, can we bump them up on your list? It should be fair to them.
Yep, they can notify one of the pages, and a few people have already done that, and that's why I'm taking them first. Go ahead.
Well, thank you very much for letting us bump ahead in line a bit. We do really appreciate it, and also being able to come together. So good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Natalie Cook, and I am a senior at Hamline University and board chair of the Minnesota Public Interest Research Group.
And my name is Ian O'Brien. I'm a senior at the University of Minnesota Duluth and the co-chair of our chapter of Emperg.
MPIRG is a statewide student-directed nonprofit that has been working on environmental and social justice issues since 1971, including helping tens of thousands of students register to vote on our 7 campuses statewide. I've helped many students register to vote and even vouched for a friend who wanted to register on the same day. The other young people that I talk to are always very excited about voting and voicing their opinion. This story is not uncommon, and it is possible because of Minnesota's election laws that allow for students to express their fundamental right, as my colleague Ian will attest.
Thank you, Natalie. Madam Chair, members of the committee. While House File 2738 is aimed at criminals, it would disenfranchise hundreds of thousands of law-abiding individuals in the process. As a student, as a UMD, I am surrounded by such individuals. Take, for instance, Eleanor Bolich. She lacks a driver's license or a permit, but instead uses a passport as her primary ID. Then there's Paul Gearing from Brooklyn Park. He is registered on Election Day without ID in several different elections. Finally, there's Kate Mensing, who is from Nevada, has a valid driver's license from that state, and if passed, these 3 individuals, along with myself and several thousand others, would face unwarranted obstacles when simply trying to vote. We cannot expect college students, the elderly, or the poor to take a 2-hour bus trip to the DMV in order to vote. We cannot expect Paul to drive 3 hours one way to his listed address in order to vote. And we cannot expect my generation to someday lead Minnesota when we systematically deter them and others from casting a ballot today. The proposed voter ID amendment will add barriers to countless students, and it would serve only to prevent voter impersonation. There are a lot of arguments as to the extent of this type of voter fraud.
Please wrap it up. Wrap it up.
Okay. And we appreciate the opportunity to come before you today.
So this lack of evidence.
I'm sorry, you've already done your two minutes. I'm sorry. I have to keep the same rules for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
And the next on the list is Chris Bell, and then I have Miss Abdul, who both cannot make it tonight. That's my understanding.
Right here.
Okay. Thanks. Where's the mic? Okay. Madam Chair, members of the committee, my name is Chris Bell, and I am co-chair of the Minnesota Consortium for Citizens with Disabilities. I've worked very hard with Representative Kiffmeyer on a number of pieces of legislation, and I admire her, but I have to disagree with her on this one. And it comes down to this, and I'd like actually your response, Representative Kiffmeyer. Photo ID is not proof of identity. It's evidence of identity. About a week before my daughter turned 21, and she was attending college in Chicago, my ex-wife, her mother, went out and took her to lunch. And the server came over and asked if anyone wanted some wine with lunch. And before my ex-wife could answer, my not yet 21-year-old daughter said yes and flapped out a fake ID. Right? And I thought it took a lot of gonadal fortitude for her to do that in front of her mother. But the point was that she got her a glass of wine. And if you go to any bartender at any bar in a college town and ask that bartender whether people use false ID cards to get a drink, I think we all know the answer. If you go onto Google and look for identification papers, there are all kinds of sites where you can create your own false ID. I'm not promoting this, but the point is that it's really easy to do. And so this whole idea about voter photo ID is protecting the integrity of elections really is filled with lots of holes. And my one other point is somewhat similar to other people. If you live out in rural Minnesota, whether you're elderly or disabled and can't drive, if you can't drive, and now you have to renew your ID or get an ID, and you have to take a cab because you don't have a neighbor or a family member that's going to do it, that can be extraordinarily expensive. And if, like a lot of my former clients, you live on supplemental security income and get $400 a month, it's just not going to happen.
I'm sorry, if you could wrap it up. It's been over 2 minutes. Thank you.
I'm done, except one other thing. I have I think this is it, I have a permit to purchase a handgun. And, all right, you know what? I had a background check, and, it's a whole complicated thing to get a permit. It was free.
Thank you, Mr. Bell.
It depends on your priorities.
Next on the list is Miss Abdul. If you could just quiet down for the next witness.
Madam Chair, Mr. Vice Chair, members of the committee, good morning or good afternoon now. When I wrote this, I thought I was going to talk in the morning. My name is Aidel Abdul. I'm a black immigrant mother with a child that has a disability and is in full support of this legislation and hope that it passes. And here is why. Number one, from an immigrant point of view, as an immigrant person myself, in the Constitution it says a person can vote when they become a U.S. citizen. When an immigrant person becomes a U.S. citizen, they get a United States citizenship certificate with your information, including your picture, from the Department of Homeland Security, although when I became a citizen, I think it was the INS, or Immigration Naturalization Service, thereby making it a government-issued ID that you can certainly use to vote, among other things. From a minority point of view, as a black woman, there's no place in this legislation that states a minority person will not be allowed to vote. In fact, it clearly indicates the need for equal verification for all voters, as well as that provided free of charge for those that are low income and cannot afford it. From a disability point of view, as a mom who has a son with disability, in order for anyone, a child or an adult, to be certified disabled and receive state and or federal disability services, one must prove who they are and that they're eligible to get disability services by providing proof with a picture on it. No one can vouch for anyone, including my son, to get disability services. Therefore, the notion that minorities and immigrants and disabled persons will not be allowed to vote because of this legislation is completely false and saturated by using emotions rather than facts.
Thank you very much. It's come to the time when we are going to have to go into recess. I know another committee is meeting here. I apologize to the folks in the audience for not being able to finish it now, but this room is reserved. So if you could just hold out. I'm not done yet. I want to make sure all the members hear me and understand. So session is at 3, and we're not exactly sure what time it's going to adjourn. We will be in room 10, and we will be able to meet 15 minutes after adjournment. So if session gets done before 6, if it gets done at 5, we'll meet at 5:15. That way we can hopefully conclude. Having said that, we are in recess.